It has always struck me as a curious irony that many in our age pit faith against reason, as though they were rival generals locked in an endless war for supremacy over the soul. Yet nothing could be more mistaken. If faith were mere blind assent without reason, it would be no virtue at all, only credulity. And if reason alone were sufficient, stripped of faith, it would become sterile and cold, like a compass with no north. Reason can trace the outlines of reality, but it cannot breathe life into them. Faith can lift the heart to heights beyond the visible, but without reason, it may lose its footing altogether. These two, far from being enemies, are like wings of a great bird. Only together can they raise the human spirit into the clear air of truth. With one wing broken, the soul circles endlessly, never finding its true home. When I reflect upon the relationship between reason and faith, I find it helpful to think of them as complementary instruments given to us by God for the same grand purpose: to know Him, to love Him, and to find our way back to Him. Reason is the God-given faculty that examines, compares, and judges. It weighs evidence, perceives patterns, and leads us out of error into clarity. Faith, on the other hand, is the steadfast trust in what we have reason to believe to be true, even when the tides of emotion or the mists of doubt would tempt us to abandon it. We are often told, "You must not believe unless you can see with your eyes." But that is nonsense. Nearly everything we hold to be true in daily life rests on trust, faith of some kind. A man trusts that his wife loves him, though he cannot prove it in a laboratory. A child trusts his father will return at evening, though he has no contract written in the stars. We accept history through the testimony of those before us. We board trains with confidence that the engineers who built the bridges knew their craft. This is not foolishness, but a reasonable faith, a faith that grows out of reasoned trust. Faith, then, is not the abandonment of reason, but its fulfillment. For reason alone can bring us only to the threshold of truth. Imagine a man tracing a map of a distant country. He may draw the rivers and mountains with mathematical precision, but until he sets foot upon that land, he knows it only abstractly. Faith is the step onto the soil. It is the willingness to live, as though what reason has shown us is indeed real. And yet, faith itself sharpens reason. A man who trusts in God begins to see not less, but more. He perceives meaning where others perceive only chaos. He hears music where others hear only noise. Faith opens the eye of the imagination, that deeper organ of sight which allows us to behold not only what is, but what ought to be, and what shall be when all things are made new. Reason and faith, like the two wings of truth, are not meant to be held apart, but to move in harmony. Each, without the other, falls into distortion. Faith, without reason, can become fanaticism, a reckless leap into superstition or self-deception. Reason without faith becomes a prison of skepticism, circling endlessly around what can be measured, yet never daring to embrace what is ultimate. I often think of it as the difference between knowing about and truly knowing. Reason may tell us about the sun, its size, its distance, its chemical composition. Faith allows us to live by its light, to trust that when dawn comes, it will warm us and guide our steps. The one describes, the other inhabits. Together they grant us not only information but illumination. And so it is with God. Reason may argue convincingly for his existence, the moral law written upon our hearts, the contingency of the universe, the beauty that awakens longing too vast for this world to satisfy. But faith is the choice to trust him, to say, "Since you are there, I will lean upon you." Reason opens the door. Faith dares to walk through. There is a kind of courage in faith, but not the courage of ignoring evidence. Rather, it is the courage of holding fast when lesser forces tug at our conviction. You see, our moods are not reliable guides. I may know by reason that a man is my friend, and yet in a moment of suspicion or hurt, feel that he is my enemy. Faith is the refusal to let mood overthrow what reason has already established. Faith steadies the soul against the winds of whim and the storms of doubt. Now, imagine the human journey as a long voyage by sea. Reason is the compass, steady and true, pointing us toward the right harbor. But faith is the sail, catching the wind of God's Spirit and carrying us forward. Compass alone cannot move the ship. Sail alone cannot keep it from drifting astray. But together they bear us onward toward the eternal shore. And in this voyage, imagination too has its place. For imagination is like the starry sky above the sailor. It does not provide the exact measurements of the compass, but it reminds him why he set sail at all. It awakens longing, a homesickness for a country never yet seen, and tells him that the journey is not in vain. Reason, faith, imagination, each plays its part in this great pilgrimage of the soul. The question often arises, why must there be faith at all? If God is real, why not make his presence so unmistakably obvious that no one could deny him? Why not write his name upon the sky in blazing letters so that reason alone would suffice? The answer, I think, is that God does not wish for slaves of compulsion, but children of love. Were his presence as undeniable as the rising sun, belief would cost us nothing, and love would be mere inevitability. Faith exists so that our trust might be freely given, so that the choice to follow him has moral weight, and so that love may be love indeed, not coercion. This is why faith and reason must both be exercised. Reason assures us that belief is not foolish, that it rests upon a foundation more solid than any shifting mood. But faith calls us beyond the threshold of certainty, into the realm of trust, where love and freedom dwell. To live only by what is forced upon our intellect would be like admiring a painting, but refusing to enter into its beauty. To live only by faith without reason would be to wander blindly through a gallery with no light to see at all. It is also worth remembering that reason itself is a gift of faith. Why do we trust our rational faculties to correspond with reality? Why believe that the thoughts produced by this small lump of matter inside our skulls happen to reflect the structure of the universe? We cannot prove reason by reason, for that would be to saw off the very branch upon which we sit. We must simply trust, have faith, that the maker of both mind and world is not a deceiver, but a God of order and truth. Faith is thus the ground upon which reason stands, even as reason refines and strengthens faith. In my own journey, I found that reason brought me to the brink of belief. It forced me to admit that atheism was too simple, that materialism could not account for the hunger of the heart, the longing for something more than this world can give. But reason alone did not carry me across the threshold. there had to come a moment of faith when I bent the knee and confessed not merely that God exists, but that He is God over me. In that surrender, reason was not discarded but fulfilled, like a seed that breaks open to become a tree. Thus, the Christian life is not an abdication of thought, but its flowering. Faith does not silence reason, it sets it singing. It is as though reason were a lamp that illuminates the path, and faith the hand that carries it forward through the night. Alone, the lamp sits in darkness. Alone, the hand stumbles blind, but together the way is made clear. When I speak of faith, I do not mean a vague optimism, nor a refusal to look squarely at the facts of life. Faith is not a painted curtain draped over reality to make it more tolerable. Rather, it is the key that unlocks reality's fullest depth. Without faith, the world remains flat and thin, like a shadow upon a wall. With faith, the same world deepens into meaning, as a flat map deepens into a living landscape. Consider love itself. Reason can explain many things about it: the chemistry of the body, the psychology of attraction, the biological instinct of preservation. Yet none of these, however accurate, can explain why we say to another, "I love you," with trembling sincerity. It is faith that allows us to trust that such a declaration points beyond mere survival, beyond mere sensation, into something eternal. Love is reasonable, but it is also more than reason. And faith is what allows us to live inside love, rather than merely observing it. It is the same with suffering. Reason may analyze the causes of pain, may calculate the probability of tragedy, may trace the effects of disease and decay. But only faith can transform suffering into something more than absurd cruelty. Faith tells us that pain is not the final word, that God Himself entered into it, and that from the darkest night can rise the dawn of resurrection. Reason gives us the framework, but faith fills it with living hope. Let me suggest another picture. Imagine truth as a great cathedral. Reason is like the scaffolding and the measuring rod, ensuring that the walls stand straight and the arches do not collapse. Faith is the willingness to step inside, to kneel upon the stone floor, to let the light of stained glass fall upon one's face. Without reason, the cathedral might crumble. Without faith, it remains an empty shell admired from outside. Together they form a dwelling place for the soul. We must beware, however, of reducing reason to mere calculation, as though it were a machine. True reason is more than logic chopping. It is a perception of order, a recognition of beauty, a seeing of things as they are. And faith, properly understood, is not irrational but suprarational. It does not contradict reason, but carries it to its highest fulfillment. Faith believes not without evidence, but beyond evidence, when reason has done all it can, and trust is required for the rest of the journey. Indeed, every act of human life rests on such a partnership. The farmer plants his seed with reasoned knowledge of the seasons, but with faith that rain will come. The artist paints with reason's discipline of form and proportion, but with faith that beauty will emerge. The lover vows with reason's knowledge of human frailty, but with faith in the promise of fidelity. If such things are true in the small, why should they not be true in the great? Reason and faith, then, are not two enemies to be reconciled, but two allies to be embraced. They are the left and right hands of the soul, the compass and the sail of the voyage, the wings of the bird soaring into the clear air of God's truth. To clip either is to hobble the whole being, but when both are spread wide, the soul rises, and one catches a glimpse of the eternal country to which we truly belong. One of the mistakes we moderns often make is imagining that reason and faith divide the world neatly in two, as though one governed the domain of facts, while the other wandered freely in the realm of feelings. But this division is false. Both belong to the same search for reality. Truth is not split into compartments. God is not merely the God of the pulpit, but of the laboratory, not only the Lord of worship, but of mathematics, music, and law. Reason is his gift, shining like a candle in the human mind. But every candle needs a flame. Faith is that flame. Without it, reason burns low, flickering in self-doubt. With it, reason blazes with purpose, its light revealing not only the mechanics of the world, but the glory within it. Take beauty, for example. Reason can measure the wavelengths of light reflected from a rose, can chart the angles of its petals, can describe the pigments in its petals. Yet none of this explains why we call it beautiful, why it stirs in us a longing not merely for roses, but for something beyond them. Faith awakens us to the reality that beauty is not accidental. It is a whisper from another world, an intimation of a greater beauty behind all beauties. Reason tells us what the rose is made of. Faith tells us why the rose matters. Or think of morality. Reason can construct arguments about ethics, can calculate consequences, can draw lines of duty. But when temptation comes, when the heart longs to excuse what the mind knows to be wrong, it is faith that gives us the courage to stand firm. Reason provides the clarity of principle. Faith provides the strength to live by it. Together, they shape a conscience both sharp and steadfast. And so, we see that reason and faith are not two parallel lines never meeting. They are two rivers flowing into one great sea. Their meeting place is in the person of Christ himself. For in him the eternal Word, reason himself, took flesh, and in him we are invited to place our faith. To trust Christ is not to abandon reason, but to embrace the very logos that reason, in its highest reach, seeks after. This is why Christianity is not merely a creed of the heart, nor merely a philosophy of the mind. It is both and more. It asks us to think and to trust, to analyze and to adore. It engages the whole man, mind, heart, and will, so that no part of us is left untouched by truth. In the end, reason and faith are the twin gifts by which God raises us above the animals and draws us nearer to himself. With them, we may begin to live not as wanderers in a meaningless universe, but as pilgrims upon a road that leads home. Reason, as I have said, gives us the outline, the structure, the architecture of belief. Faith fills that outline with living color. Yet the two together are not static. They grow, sharpen, and refine one another in the life of the soul. Think of a tree. Reason is the trunk, straight and firm, holding all together. Faith is the sap, flowing unseen, giving life to every leaf. One without the other is lifeless. A trunk with no sap is only timber, rigid but dead. Sap with no trunk is only a flood, directionless and wasted. Together they make something living, something that points upward, reaching toward heaven. We must not forget that both reason and faith involve humility. Reason requires the humility to admit when we are wrong, to accept that our arguments may falter, and our conclusions must be revised. Faith requires the humility to confess that we are not self-sufficient, that we must lean upon another. Pride is the enemy of both. The proud man may scorn faith as weakness, or twist reason into weaponry for his own ends. But the humble man sees that both are gifts, and in gratitude he uses them rightly. And there is yet a deeper mystery. Faith itself enlarges reason. When one believes in God, the world ceases to be random. Patterns emerge, meanings shine through. It is as though reason were a lantern, and faith the oil that allows it to burn brighter and longer than before. In faith, reason discovers not less, but more. The skeptic who scoffs at faith thinks he is keeping reason pure. In truth, he is starving it of light. The interplay of reason and faith also touches our longing for eternity. For reason can tell us that all earthly joys are fleeting, that time marches inexorably on, that death awaits. But faith tells us that these fleeting joys are not cruel tricks. They are foretastes of a greater joy, echoes of a music whose full symphony lies ahead. Reason shows us the limits of this world. Faith reveals that those limits are not the end. Together, they explain why our homesickness for heaven is not madness, but sanity. This is why Christianity insists that to believe is not to close the mind, but to open it. The believer is not one who abandons reason, but one who lets it take its rightful place, hand in hand with faith. It is a harmony, not a rivalry, a duet, not a duel. So let us not be deceived into thinking that faith and reason are like two contestants fighting for the crown. They are fellow servants of truth, and when they walk together, they lead us into the presence of the one who is both light for the mind and life for the soul. If reason and faith are the two wings of truth, then it is not surprising that when one of them falters, the flight of the soul becomes troubled. History bears witness to this imbalance. When faith has been severed from reason, religion has sometimes sunk into superstition, into rituals without understanding, into credulity that mistakes every shadow for a revelation. On the other hand, when reason has been cut off from faith, civilizations have drifted into despair, into materialism that explains everything but believes in nothing, into a hollow cleverness that can dissect the atom, but cannot answer why one ought not to use it for destruction. Faith and reason, like lovers long betrothed, are meant to belong together. Their unity safeguards us from extremes. Faith saves reason from arrogance. Reason saves faith from folly. Together they guard the integrity of the human soul. Let me draw another image. Suppose you stand before a great mountain. Reason is the map in your hand, showing the contours, the valleys, the pathways to the summit. Faith is the strength in your legs, the resolve in your heart that makes you walk the path. What use is the map if you will not walk? And what use is the desire to climb if you have no map? The summit is reached only when both are joined in the ascent. But here is the wonder. As you climb, faith enlarges reason. The higher you go, the broader the view becomes, and reason perceives patterns it never saw at the base. Faith keeps you climbing, and reason rewards you with ever-widening horizons. One feeds the other. until, at last, you behold the summit not as an abstraction, but as a living reality. And this is, I think, why the Scriptures themselves appeal to both faculties. God does not simply command blind belief. He reasons with his people. Come now, let us reason together. Yet neither does he confine himself to syllogisms, but calls us to trust. The just shall live by faith. It is always both, the mind illumined and the heart surrendered. Christianity, if true, is a great romance of the intellect and the will. It satisfies reason by its coherence, by its power to explain the facts of history and the hunger of the heart. And it satisfies faith by its invitation to trust in the God who reveals himself in love. To embrace it fully, one must think deeply and trust wholly. And so, my friends, if ever you are tempted to imagine that faith and reason are rivals, remember the bird in flight, the ship at sea, the tree alive with both trunk and sap. They are not enemies, but companions, drawing us upward, onward, and homeward. There is a tendency in the modern mind to exalt reason, as though it were sovereign and sufficient in itself, a flawless judge sitting upon the throne of truth. But reason is not a god. It is a servant. It serves truth faithfully only when it is humble, only when it acknowledges that it has limits. One can no more exhaust reality by reason than one can drain the ocean with a teaspoon. Faith enters where reason, having done all it can, bows in reverence before mysteries too great for calculation. Consider love again. Reason can point to its necessity for the survival of the race, can explain the chemical surges in the body, but reason cannot compel love, nor can it explain why love is the deepest joy of the soul, why it feels at once fragile and indestructible. Faith perceives that love has its origin not in the flux of nature, but in the eternal heart of God, who is himself love. Reason sketches the frame. Faith beholds the masterpiece. Or think of hope. Reason can calculate probabilities, measure trends, analyze outcomes, but it cannot promise hope beyond the grave. Faith alone dares to say, this life is not the end. Yet notice, it is not a blind assertion. Reason has already whispered that the longing of the heart, the hunger for permanence, the desire for justice, cannot be explained if the grave is all. Faith takes that whisper and turns it into a song. Even science, so often thought the domain of reason alone, rests ultimately on faith. Every experiment assumes that the laws of nature today will be the same tomorrow, that the universe is intelligible, that our minds are trustworthy instruments. But none of this can be proved by science itself. It is faith. Faith that reality is rational, because its maker is rational, that undergirds the whole enterprise. Reason without this faith would have no foundation upon which to stand. And so, in every sphere of life, the partnership holds. Faith is not an intrusion into reason's domain, nor is reason an intruder into faith's sanctuary. Together, they form the harmony of a human soul rightly ordered. To be half a creature, guided only by reason, or only by faith, is to limp through existence. To be whole is to fly, borne up by the two wings that God has given. One day, when the veil is lifted, and we behold God face to face, reason and faith will not vanish. Rather, they will be fulfilled. Reason will rejoice to see all its questions answered, its fragments joined into a perfect whole. Faith will rejoice to find that what it trusted in, though unseen, was truer and more solid than mountains. Both will melt into worship, for worship is the consummation of both thought and trust. It is a grave mistake to imagine that faith begins where reason ends, as if it were a desperate leap into darkness once logic has failed. No, faith is not the abandonment of light, but its extension. It is as though reason were the lamp by which we see a path, and faith the courage to keep walking when the path bends into shadow. One does not discard the lamp. One carries it forward, trusting that the path continues, though it cannot yet be seen. Think also of memory. Reason recalls the past, events, causes, consequences. Faith remembers in another way. It clings to promise made, even when circumstances tempt us to despair. A child trusts his mother's word that she will return, though she is absent. So the Christian clings to God's word, believing him faithful even when his face seems hidden. In this way, faith is reason remembering God's character in the dark. And what of obedience? Reason may tell us that honesty is better than deceit, that courage is better than cowardice, that love is nobler than selfishness. Yet when temptation presses heavily, when fear or desire overwhelm, reason alone is often too weak. Faith supplies the strength to act upon what reason knows is right. Faith is not opposed to reason. It is reason armed for battle. There is, too, the matter of wonder. Reason examines the flower, dissects it, names its parts. Faith kneels before it, recognizing in its beauty the smile of the Creator. Reason asks, "How does this exist?" Faith whispers, "Why does this exist? And why does it move me so deeply?" In their union, awe is born, a knowledge that is not cold calculation, nor blind feeling, but a marriage of truth and joy. And let us not forget that both reason and faith are ordered toward a common end, to lead us home. We are in this life exiles. We live with a homesickness that nothing here quite satisfies. Reason tells us it is absurd that fleeting pleasures should exhaust the hunger of the heart. Faith tells us that this hunger points beyond the world, to the feast prepared in the kingdom of God. Reason argues that we are more than animals. Faith sings that we are children of the Father. Thus, the Christian is not asked to choose between thinking and trusting, between logic and love, between head and heart. He is asked to use both, as God intended. To refuse either is to maim the soul. To embrace both is to find oneself borne upward, like a bird upon the wind, toward that country where truth and love are one. And so, my friends, we come to the end of this long meditation. We have journeyed together through many images, of wings in flight, of ships at sea, of mountains climbed and cathedrals entered, all to show that reason and faith are not adversaries but companions. They are the two wings of truth, meant to lift the soul into the clear air of reality. To break either is to hobble the whole man. To use both is to discover that life is not meaningless wandering, but pilgrimage, not a riddle without an answer, but a song whose music we only now begin to hear. What, then, is the final lesson? It is this, that God has not left us destitute. He has given us reason, that we might discern His fingerprints upon the universe. And He has given us faith, that we might take his hand and follow him home. Reason examines, faith embraces. Reason measures, faith leaps. Reason seeks, faith rests. They are not rivals, but friends, and in their harmony we find not confusion, but clarity, not division, but wholeness. To live by reason alone is to remain outside the feast, holding only the menu in our hands. To live by faith alone is to sit at the table without understanding the goodness of the meal. But to live by both is to taste and to know, to see and to savor. In such a life, truth ceases to be a cold abstraction and becomes a living person, Christ himself, who is both the Logos, the eternal reason of God, and the one in whom we place our faith. In him, the two wings at last beat as one, and we are carried upward toward our true destiny. One day, when the veil is lifted and the journey complete, there will be no rivalry between these faculties. Reason will rejoice to see every fragment joined, every question answered, every mystery unveiled. Faith will rejoice to see that its trust was never misplaced, that the unseen was more solid than stone, more enduring than time. Both will bow together in worship, for worship is the consummation of both thought and trust, both seeking and finding. But until that day, let us live as pilgrims with steady minds and trusting hearts. Let us not be cowed by the false dichotomy of our age, which would sever what God has joined. Let us think deeply, for God gave us minds to glorify him. Let us believe steadfastly, for he calls us to trust him as children trust their Father. And let us remember always that the truth is not something we invent, but someone we meet, and in his light reason and faith are not enemies, but fellow travelers. May we then spread both wings wide and fly, not in circles of doubt, not in the downward spiral of despair, but upward into the clear air of God's reality, where joy is made full and love without shadows awaits us. If this reflection has spoken to you, I invite you to like, to share, to comment your thoughts below, and to subscribe, so that together we may continue this journey of faith and reason, walking as pilgrims homeward, step by step, wing by wing.